Most of you are aware of who the Food Policy Council is. However, for those who need a reminder or who are not as familiar with the Greater Cincinnati Regional Food Policy Council, we are a cross-sector collaboration of organizations and individuals driving impact through advocacy and coordinated action. So, for example, this Train the Trainer is one of those things that we are that we try to enact advocacy and coordinated action through. We are a regional council, so that means that we cover a 10-county region, 4 counties in northern Kentucky, 4 counties in southwest Ohio, and 2 counties in southeast Indiana. We also, our vision is to create a resilient regional food system. So when we say resilience, we are talking about social, economic, and environmental resiliency. So we try very much to have a holistic view of what the food system looks like, all the way from the producer or farmer to the consumer and everything in between. So yes, we're very much in that holistic point of view. It is important to know that a part of this training includes a resource guide. So you should have received it in the email before this presentation, but if for some reason you did not, we will be dropping it in the chat later on, just to let everybody know. So this next slide, I'm not going to read it for you. It's actually going to be in page 4 of the resource guide, both for the all the titles and the nutrition title resource guide. So I'm not going to read this slide to you. We just need to put it up here. The general gist of it is that we are a program of a 501c3 nonprofit. And as a 501c3 nonprofit, we have to track the amount of lobbying we do as an organization. So in order to toe that line, making sure that we don't do too much advocacy, too much lobbying, we instead lean into advocacy through education and resource development. So this, for example, the Train the Trainer is a perfect example of that advocacy through education and resource development. And that's basically the general gist of this slide. You can read it in depth either during the recording or from our resource guide on page 4. So I do want to talk about the purpose of this training. So this Train the Trainer is meant to amplify the Food Policy Council reach by expanding advocacy efforts. So we really want to think about this training more as a 201 rather than a 101 on the Farm Bill. So we won't be spending a lot of time talking about the information around the Farm Bill, but rather how to discuss the Farm Bill. And we're going to do that today by trying to build capacity to inspire confidence in others so you can lead Farm Bill advocacy. We are trying to share resources such as the resource guide, but other information as well that includes story, data, and potential call to actions. We're also going to be training on advocacy and communication best practices, including how to adapt information to your particular audience. Another thing is we are a regionally focused organization, like I mentioned, and our vision is to build a resilient food system in a very holistic way. So this training is going to emphasize regional data, which means that it's mostly data that is focused on Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana, a holistic perspective of the food system, so both stories and data from the farmers to the consumers, and how the Farm Bill impacts the regional system. And then we're also going to try to share opportunities to build a resilient food system that focuses on economic, environmental, and social resiliency through policy and legislation. Well, specifically the Farm Bill policy and legislation. So I keep referencing the resource. So we have 2 resource guides. one that covers majority of titles. And then we also separated a resource guide specifically on nutrition title. That nutrition is a huge part of the Farm Bill, so we thought it was a good idea to separate nutrition into its own piece, just because there's so much information to try to absorb that the resource guide would be humongous otherwise, I think, even beyond what size it is now. But these resources are meant to curate the stories from our regional and national stakeholders. USDA and food system data from Ohio, Kentucky, and/or Indiana. Some of the information covers just one state, just because it might, for a variety of reasons. We also included recommendations from state and national platforms that with a highlight on how it would impact the region and how it could be implemented regionally. And then finally, we also included examples of marker bills. Marker bills are bills that are not meant to be passed necessarily on their own right, but rather as a way to support particular issues in the Farm Bill. And they can be used as call to actions or potential solutions for reasons of like legislators can co-sponsor these bills as we're going through the authorization process. Also, the purpose of the resource guide. So the reason that we're giving you access to this, and actually after this presentation in the next week or so, you'll be able to have your own link, your own individual link to both resources. So that way you can kind of adapt and change as you need it for whatever audience you're talking to, whether in a formal or informal way. And the purpose of this resource is to use it as framework and then build upon it either on your own knowledge or be able to build upon it to share with your intended audience. It's meant to adapt based on the audience that you're planning on talking to. So if you want to add or remove things, you can. And then also we want a focus on state-specific data and stories and call to actions. Especially if you're planning on talking to people, legislators or organizations that are serving a particular state, because someone serving Greater Cincinnati, they might just be interested in Ohio and not so much Kentucky or Indiana or Michigan, right? We want to have that state-specific information. So let me kind of go briefly through our resource guide. I won't linger too much, but this is a slide of the resource guide that covers all the most of the titles other than nutrition and trade. We actually did not include trade in our resources because that has an international perspective and it's out of the scope of a regional food policy council. But as you can see, it's formatted in a particular way where there's a formula that we follow called story, data, call to action. And actually the format of all the sections, which are broken down into the titles, start with the stories first. Then we go on to the section where it's data. And then we go on to the section of call to actions, which include recommendations and marker bills that align with that particular title. So we'll have a chance to look through it in our next breakout session. Like I mentioned, I will not be spending too much time on the, I won't be spending too much time on the structure of the Farm Bill, but I do want to point out that we have 12 titles. So nutrition has its own resource guide because as you can see here, it's almost 80% of Farm Bill funding and budget. And we also don't talk a lot about trade as a food policy council because trade has an international scope. So it's kind of beyond our bandwidth and we don't include it. And we actually have two different introductory videos, one in collaboration with Slow Foods USA and another that we've done on our own that include more introductory information on the Farm Bill. We sent it out as pre-work, but if you still need to review it, please do, so that way you have additional comfort around what the Farm Bill actually is. Again, I'm not going to linger too much on the timeline of the Farm Bill. However, I do want to point out that we are currently in this portion of the Farm Bill where each of the chambers, the House and the Senate, are still discussing their own versions, drafting, amending, and voting upon its own version of the bill before it's introduced to each of the chambers. So we're not at the point where each of the chamber is going to be voting on their version that will then be compiled into one whole thing. So we're still very much in the drafting stage. And the goal is the Farm Bill should be reauthorized by the end of September 2023. There's a little bit of back and forth about if we're actually on that timeline, but we are moving forward as if it's going to be reauthorized at the end of September 2023. So one housekeeping thing I wanted to reiterate is we are dropping resources in the chat, whether that is the resource guide or other websites that we're referencing. We are going to capture all of this, all the chat in and share it to make sure that you have the links. A lot of this information was sent out as pre-work in a sense, but we'll make sure to reiterate and make sure that you get it. In addition, I know that some people were requesting because they were outside of my organization, so Google was being annoying. Thank you for requesting access. And if we continue to have issues, we'll make sure if it doesn't get resolved by the end of this training, you will have it resolved so you can have access to it later in the future. So do not worry. So kind of moving on, we are again recording this, so you will have access to both the slides and my talking. So you will have reference to both after we sometime next week, after we finish our training. So let's kind of go on to we do want to give a shout out to resources of platforms and other organizations that are doing Farm Bill advocacy, either at the state or national level. So you can see the variety of platforms that we use as references and as guides for the Regional Food Policy Council. And that includes OFA, our state partner in Ohio, the Kentucky Food Action Network, which is a state partner we have in Kentucky, along with other national organizations that we borrowed recommendations from, and they have done a lot of work over creating these very intensive, massive platforms that have a very either state or national view of our agricultural system. We do have a QR code that actually directs you to, we have a QR code sheet that directs you to all of these platforms. So if you are interested in reading any of these, you can. And so just FYI, we will be dropping that into the chat. So thank you to them for doing this hard work. So in addition to those national platforms, we do want to provide a shout out to some additional resources, both internal resources that we created as Greater Cincinnati Food Policy Council, but also some other resources that others may not know is available. We had a summer intern who was a dietetics student at University of Cincinnati, and she created a starting point for community health indicators that are focused on the 10 counties that the Food Policy Council represents. There are other community health indicator spreadsheets and databases that exist, but not from the reason that we wanted to create this was because it focused on the 10 counties that we as the Food Policy Council represented. But other databases like the Policy Map, and something else through the USDA called the Food and Agriculture Mapping Explorer. They are both databases that exist around community health indicators and other aspects of the food system. Like I mentioned, we do have that QR code sheet of a variety of stakeholder platforms and their Farm Bill campaigns that will drop in the chat. In addition, we have a variety of things on our website, such as food system reports like around urban agriculture. The Office of Environment and Sustainability in Cincinnati has a variety of resources. Produce Perks Midwest has a variety of resources, along with other state partners such as Kentucky Food Action Network and OFA. So we're going to be dropping some of those resources in the chat. The community health indicator spreadsheet that our summer intern started, that is available upon request. So I kind of referred to this beforehand in terms of when I was originally talking about and introducing the resource guide. We formatted our resource guide into a formula that we're actually borrowing with permission from the Kentucky Food Action Network. And this formula is story, data, call to action. And the reason that, at least for the Food Policy Council, this formula resonates is because it's a advocacy tool that is easy to follow and straightforward to follow from both the person advocating and the person you're advocating to, because it also brings it from issues like this is a problem to potential solutions. So as an individual in the food system, these are the barriers I am facing, and here are opportunities that we can do to improve those barriers and to eliminate those barriers. So any good story formula call to action there's some tips that you can follow, which includes a good story has 3 parts of story of self, story of us, and story of now. It also shares the reason and purpose that you're writing or advocating. We use the word writing just because it was meant as like a writing tool, but replace the word writing with any sort of form of advocacy, and then transition to the actual story you're planning on telling. Share how this relates to you and the people that you represent. And also, it's really important, no matter how you're advocating, to know your audience and how long you have to talk or write or interact with them, right? And then if you're doing any sort of data sharing, make sure you cite sources and you want to make sure that you're using sources that support your story. So this formula, I think, can be really helpful for any advocate and any kind of audience you're planning on advocating to. On this slide, you'll see examples of advocacy communication that's much more broad and big picture. And you may notice that when I start talking, I might say the word presentation, but that isn't limited to that, right? That formal setting. It could be coffee table conversations. It could be informal in your just everyday relationships. But however that may be, we hope that some of these techniques resonate. I already made the example of that positive, inclusive language that's not defensive. And I think another layer to that is this: avoid villainizing the other side, whatever you may view the other side may be, right? Because we are trying, when you are building resiliency, at least around the food system, might mean different things for different people, and their role within the food system is different. Everybody's role is different, and what they see as resilient for themselves and their work might not be the same as you. So trying not to avoid villainizing each other, right? And trying to meet each other where you are. Other examples is like making sure that your examples and your stories and your data appeal to the audience. So whether you're talking to a farmer of like, hey, this is what's happening with the farm bill, making sure like it's relevant to their everyday lives. If you're talking to a consumer who might utilize the nutrition programs, tailoring the language to include, to focus on examples around actual nutrition programs. Another thing is the language, and I think we all kind of came up with and made sure to include this, is that the language should be clear and concise. And what I mean by clear and concise, that's different depending on who your audience is. I think Jack made the example of newsletters that are tailored to your, tailored to people who already work in the food system and who are already advocates. Sounds very different. It can sound a bit different than when you're talking to individuals who aren't really engaged in the food system, who might be interested but aren't super engaged. But also, even when you are talking to advocates, making sure that you explain what your acronyms is. The beauty or the pitfall, depending on your perspective, of the USDA is there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of offices, there's a lot of programs. So finding ways to explain these complex systems that everyone can understand is going to be really important. So if that means you start every conversation with a brief overview of definitions, right? Or finding that you avoid the alphabet soup and say the full name of the program, right? Like there's ways to avoid confusion. And then also, one big thing that I wanted to mention is, though this is a bit controversial, I believe, and I think that is that you want to ask for big things now, and then that way it leaves room for negotiation. So when you're advocating or encouraging others to advocate, you want to be realistic. You don't want such pie in the sky stuff that is not actually achievable. You want big achievable things, but that way, when you're talking to a legislator, when you're talking to a policymaker, they can't say, well, you never asked for that. You never asked for this solution. So why? So I didn't know you wanted it. But instead, if you ask for those things, there's some room to meet in the middle and compromise if necessary. So those are kind of some examples that we have. So, you know, again, presentations for us at the Food Policy Council, we have, we found that our lane was talking about presentations and creating this buddy system. So part of this registration was potentially working with organizations that might want to host a trainer, for example, if anybody's interested in that follow-up. So that way you get an opportunity to talk about the Farm Bill around with an organization or a group that wants to learn more and more about particular topics. However, formal presentations are not the only way to engage your network, right? There's a lot of wonderful tools around listening sessions and coffee chats, right? Where it's more of a conversation and hearing what other people have to say. It could be more like panels and roundtables. So our organization Green Umbrella hosted a Midwest Regional Sustainability Summit that included a lot of panels and roundtables, but OFA also hosts a conference, and they're very used to that. Another thing is letters to the editor. Again, we want to amplify things that are already doing. So the OFA is actually very into letters to the editor and as a big tool of advocacy. So they have a lot of resources available if you're interested in writing letters to the editor. Meet and greets. What I mean by this is, for example, the Ohio Farmers Market Network and even Kentucky Food Action Network are hosting meet and greets with legislators at local farmers markets during National Farmers Market Week. So that's another opportunity, but also, and then finally attending council and council meetings and in-district meetings. So Federal legislators are hosting in-district meetings when they're on recess at the beginning of August. So attending that as an advocate and encouraging your network to attend as well, particularly if those federal legislators are on the committees around agriculture, but even if they're not on the committees of agriculture. And then also learning to engage your city council, because we are our city council, you'll notice that more and more cities can apply or are applying for USDA grants that affect city legislation. So it actually does matter for city councils, even though they might not agree, that they know more about the Farm Bill and this federal legislation that trickles down to state, county, and city. So during whatever presentation or format that you plan to do in terms of advocating, there's a lot of ways to keep people engaged. So one example is those breakout sessions where conversations can happen among peers to help support one another. Another thing during breakout sessions is kind of like these idea sessions. So for example, around the Food Policy Council farm to school planning sessions, we actually use Jamboard, which is a Google app that you can use to kind of use as Post-it notes. So even if you're meeting virtually, there's tools to have like those idea sessions. We have you could also include letter writing or postcard writing activities. So for example, the Food Policy Council is actually doing a letter writing campaign with our council and committee members. We have a letter writing guide that we will be posting in the chat, but you could host your own, even if it's like a dinner and people come and write their letters and then they can send it to their legislators. There's also activities in which you can create a narrative, so people who might not so people can better understand a variety of lived experiences. That one activity is actually an activity that is nutrition title specific, that is hunger. It's focusing on hunger in Kentucky. We are working with one of our council members to film a video on how to do it. So if you're interested in learning more about that activity, we'll have that available in the next couple of weeks. And finally, a really neat idea is creating like these live quizzes or these questionnaires during your presentation. So if you're giving a Farm Bill 101 and you want to see how what people are learning and maybe areas that you can adjust your conversation over and provide more information, there's these like live questions or questionnaires that you can do during your presentation. I do want to warn that some people don't love the idea of quizzes. So if you are in an environment that's not highly competitive, maybe not call it a quiz, for example. Oh, wrong direction. Oh, nope. Very wrong direction. Sorry, y'all. So finally, we are going to get into the actual resource guide in terms of providing some examples. So like I mentioned, the resource guide is broken down into each title of the Farm Bill, right? So each section is named after a title. So there in your resource guide, there's a section that's specifically on Title VII, which is resource education and other related matters. And then each part of that title then has a portion of story, data, call to action. So this is actually one of the stories that are from the research section. So I won't read this story, but the reason that I included this story is because it's a story that includes all those points that we made from the K-FAN slide, where there's a story of self, a story of us, there's grounding it into why it matters and the purpose of bringing this up. So this story is specifically talking about how there should be more research for farmers, ranchers, and farm workers around mitigating and adapting to the climate crisis, and that the research is necessary to better adapt. That's the purpose of that story, right? So that sets up a narrative around it sets up a narrative of what you're trying to convey. Then you want to include data, right? And in this data, you want data that supports your story. So this data shows two pieces. One, the total amount of money that Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio received around research from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and how much of that money are for particular topic-specific projects. So in the resource guide, I listed all the projects that I included in the second column, but a lot of them are focused on climate and crisis, climate mitigation and adaptation research, food system research, that is like community building, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see the difference between how much money each state gets and some of the more targeted food system focused climate mitigation and adaptation research that those states received in 2020. So that supports the story of we need more money around climate crisis mitigation and adaptation for farmers, ranchers, and farm workers, right? So then we stated the issue, right? We created a story, we have the data that supports the story, and then we're going to be talking about examples of call to action. So both of these are examples of marker bills and a recommendation from that section of research in our resource guide. So because we're calling for more money around climate crisis mitigation and adaptation research, I included an example of a marker bill that means to address issues around research money for those topics. And then I included a recommendation, right, that includes prioritizing soil health, which is an example of climate mitigation and adaptation and research that could support that. So that way you take the issue and turn it into a potential solution. And that's why we formatted the resource guide the way we did. So that is the example. And the reason that I took research as an example in this particular area is because that was the second most popular topic. We'll actually have an example of nutrition in the same format in the next couple of slides. So I talked about, I gave a practical example of that story data call to action formula, right? Now I want to reference, if we're talking to federal legislators, whether through direct conversation or letter writing, we know that for senators and representatives who are on the committees of agriculture, there is assumed some buy-in to why the Farm Bill is important, right? But if you're talking to federal legislators or even state legislators who are not involved in the Farm Bill, but have interests around certain topics, whether it's aging or small business and entrepreneurship, world development, energy and supply chains, right? These are all different examples of how do you get them to care about the Farm Bill, right? So if you have a legislator who's interested in aging, who at the federal level is actually on a committee of aging, then talking about the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program and how it's a tool to support our aging population is really helpful, right? And then talking about how it's used at our state and regional level is important. If somebody is interested in small entrepreneurship and small business, then small family farms and farmers markets are hubs for that small business and entrepreneurship. And supporting those small family farms and farmers markets are going to amplify the positive effects of local entrepreneurship, for example. So actually, all of these examples are in the letter writing guide that was sent as pre-work, but we'll drop in the chat. So that way you can see that. And though we use the word federal legislators, if you are focused more on state legislators and where they can support like the State Department of Agriculture, for example, you can still engage them in that conversation because, you know, federal money comes in through the Department of Agriculture for the state. While there's also funding from the state level as well, but you can look at what interests they have and be like, hey, you might not be directly involved in agriculture, but you can still, agriculture still affects the work you do. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking federal, state, you still can see what committees they're involved in and get them engaged in some capacity, if that makes sense. Great. And don't worry, we will have time for questions and answers, as you may have seen on the agenda. So please make sure that if you have any questions to hold on to them, and we'll make sure to answer them. Okay, so I talked about the research portion of our resource guide and use an example of a story, some data, and some call to actions from that particularly. But let's say we are talking about nutrition, because a lot of people on this call are really interested in nutrition and how to talk about and advocate around nutrition. So I also wanted to provide a specific example on that. So in our resource guide around specifically the nutrition title, I took a story. I actually took data and a call to action to use as an example of how I would talk about it. So my scenario is I'm talking to a farmer's market in Kentucky that is authorized to take SNAP, which is a nutrition program. And the farmers market team wants to lead their farmers in advocating for SNAP as an economic tool that supports producers, right? So the focus is that economic support and economic tool of nutrition programs. So the Kentucky Double Dollars, which is very similar to the Ohio Produce Perks Midwest, but it's the Kentucky version, and they match dollar for dollar up to a certain point for those purchasing with SNAP at farmers markets and local grocery stores. And they used an impact report from 2017 to 2022 to show the economic multiplier that Kentucky Double Dollars can be in order to support the economic impact, the local economic impact. So you can see from this chart that the amount of money matched through the Kentucky Double Dollars, or KDD, has increased from 2017 to 2022. The economic multiplier is the same, but because we've seen an increased amount of money given out through KDD, you see more and more economic impact over the time, right? So this is, which is great for local economies. Now, that information could be given more, could do more, because historically, SNAP benefits are calculated on a fairly outdated formula that has not really been adjusted for rises of food cost in the last at least 10 years, if not more, right? And so if we support a marker bill called Closing the Meal Gap, where the food, where SNAP is adjusted based on low-cost food plans rather than the outdated formula, there's a great chance that the multiplier economic impact can be increased if more SNAP benefits are available to consumers, which then will help small farmers and other local entrepreneurs that are participating in farmers markets. So that, to me, is the way I would format that, because See, for some people, SNAP, you can have a conversation about how it is about the health and wellness of individuals, right? Knowing your audience, some of them, that is what's important to them, while other people in the audience are going to be more invested in the economic impact of the nutrition benefits, right? So knowing who you're talking to and how you format it is going to create, it's important because you're going to engage them better. So I wanted to use a less obvious example of that economic tool in this kind of role-playing scenario. I do want to open up the floor to questions and even just any sort of comment or question. So it doesn't have to be a question specifically. I do want to, again, reiterate, I know that we saw in the chat that there were a couple of questions about the letter writing guide, and then some of the resources for OFA, the letters to the editor, for example, and I believe all of that was shared in the chat. Thank you, Maddie, and everybody who shared. But again, we're capturing all of that and make sure that we will follow up with all of those resources as well, so that way you can refer back to them and you don't have to be like, oh no, I forgot it, or I forgot to copy and paste. So those will be coming up. Those will be shared. So I want to open up the floor to any questions, comments, suggestions. Feel free to unmute yourself. You don't have to raise your hand.
I have a question. I was just wondering if you know the composition of this group that is on the call. Are they mainly from larger cities or any small farming areas? I'm just curious what the reach was.
Great question. If I'm not mistaken, for the majority, a lot of us are from even Cincinnati, specifically in this, or Toledo. I think a couple of maybe Columbus, but is anybody from a more rural area or represent a more rural area? I know Nicole from OFA is going to interact with, especially OFA has a lot of Amish population and farmers that they interact with, but is there any other rural areas that are represented here today? Feel free to chime in. The silence I see as a no. So I assume no. I guess that is the answer to your question, Kimberly. Does that lead to any other questions or comments?
Just as a follow-up, I was wondering how, since I'm equating smaller cities, areas, rural with agriculture, how do we get more representation there, because they may be the on the ground folks that can talk to farmers and spread the word about the Farm Bill and understanding what they can do to support it.
That is a really great question, and I think a very common common barrier. What is great about certain state organizations is that they have coordinators and other individuals in their organization that is able to have like boots on the ground. So for example, OFA and the Kentucky Food Action Network in Kentucky, they both dedicate staff time to having those conversations with farmers, especially in rural areas, and help with that, keeping it, bridging the gap and making sure that they're a part of that conversation. Another thing is for the Food Policy Council, we have this, especially in this cohort of council members, have made a big effort to include more farmers on the council as those representatives. So for example, we have a farmer named Emily, and then another farmer named Morgan, who both live in more rural parts of our 10-county region. And they have been very involved in the communication around the Food Policy Council and our advocacy around the Farm Bill. So that is, I think everybody is making a lot of solid efforts. I know even the City of Cincinnati, the Office of Environment and Sustainability, they're hoping to coordinate more conversations around the Rural Energy for America program, around that helps both rural development and energy, renewable energy in the agricultural system. So there's definitely a lot of solid efforts to address that exact problem that you're that exact problem that you're mentioning. These are all wonderful, great points, and I think we can. There's some. I do want to get everybody out on time, so I would love to take. If somebody has one more quick question, otherwise, what we can do is drop. If you have any questions that we don't have time to address right now, what I can do is make sure that I follow up, and you can drop them in the chat, so that way we can make sure to answer all of those questions that you may have. So, and thank you for dropping that, the agro ecosystem management system. So thank you for providing that. We'll make sure to that if you don't grab it now, we will make sure to put it in our resource. So if there's no more questions for right now, I just want to kind of I want to make sure to get everybody out on time, because I want to give everybody a chance to go on with their day. So here is my email, amanda@greenumbrella.org. I realized I forgot the .org. Apologies about that. But I did email everyone before, but feel free to email me or Maddie if you have any more questions, need any more advice, if you have any other ideas in order to continue this advocacy and opportunity around advocacy. The Food Policy Council is doing its own letter writing campaign with our committee and council members, which also might be a wonderful opportunity if you want to join one of our committees. We are still wanting people to get involved and have a variety of voices and experiences, both lived and worked. Then also we want you to host your own advocacy event, whether it's formal or informal, and we would love to make sure we spotlight it in some capacity. So please stay in touch about that. But also, like I mentioned, we are having that kind of buddy up system for those who referenced that they might be interested in their organization hosting a advocacy event. I will be following up next week through email, so please keep an eye out. And we'd love to get that started. That's kind of all we have. Unless anybody has any other lingering questions, feel free to start chopping off, and we hope you all stay in touch. Thank you so much for these 2 hours.